Timeless Place by Con Maloney. Read by Graham Hoadly. George Regan's brothers called him the man who lives in the past, and with good reason. Living by himself with plenty of time on his hands, he spent most afternoons reading about his beloved Isle of Dogs and delving into library archives. George had worked as a stevedore in the Millwall dock, but when it closed 15 years ago, he reluctantly retrained as a black cab driver to supplement his dwindling redundancy money. Regan only took his taxi out for a few hours every evening, and he absolutely hated it. Cabbing was a lonely, unpredictable occupation, and the competition for trade in London was getting fiercer by the year. While stuck in yet another traffic jam or waiting for his next fare, he often reminisced about the years he spent working on the quayside among lifelong friends, men he'd grown up with and trusted. He missed their light-hearted repartee. It made the physical graft seem lighter, and the hours pass more quickly. It was New Year's Eve, 1994. The busiest night of the year for a taxi driver, so Regan drove to the West End in the early evening. After ferrying dozens of excited partygoers to their destinations, he turned off his light to avoid having to pick up inebriated passengers once the clock struck midnight, and headed home, arriving just before 10. He strolled to his local, the Kingsbridge Arms, found a quiet corner and pored over a history book as usual. A familiar voice interrupted him. "George, did you hear they're demolishing St. Edmunds Church next week?" He looked up to see his old stevedore pal, Terry Sullivan, and soon the two men were deep in conversation. "I knew it was closed, Sully, but that's terrible news. Thought they were just repairing it." "Thing is," his friend whispered, "my Cathy's the cleaner at the church, and she's got the keys. Father Jim's staying at the vicarage in Castalia Square while the new church is being built. Oh, we thought you might want to take some photos inside before they start knocking it down." Regan's face lit up, and he eagerly accepted the offer, arranging to meet Cathy just outside the church door at 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon. 10 minutes before midnight, George put on his black donkey jacket and cap, waved good-night to Terry at the bar, and left. It was an unusually mild evening for the time of year, so he decided to take a detour via the Millwall outer dock, which backed onto his home in Tiller Road. Entering the West Quay beneath the rusting base of its 2 sentinel cranes, he found himself completely alone. He made his way to a metal bench 50 yards ahead, a favourite daytime perch of his. Gazing across the ink-black water to where the silos of the McDougall's mill once held sway, he picked up indistinct murmuring voices, gently carried on the breeze, even though the dock was deserted. They seemed to be saying, "Benny," which made no sense to him. As he strained to listen, a sudden wave of raucous singing and shouting swept across the water, and the muffled voices stopped. A glance at his watch confirmed it was midnight. 1995 had arrived. The celebrations were coming from the Kingsbridge Arms, and he imagined everyone in the public bar forming an impromptu tipsy conga line and rushing out into the road outside. This memory forced a rare smile, until he recalled that this same dock, once full of ships sounding their horns to welcome in the new year, now lay eerily silent. George continued his journey around the vacant quay until it merged with the inner dock. With a hefty kick He sent a pebble flying into the water with a dull plop, disturbing its calm surface. His attention was drawn up towards colourful laser lights heralding the new year from the Canary Wharf Tower's pyramid roof. Powerful beams were projecting south across the island and over the river to the top of Observatory Hill in Greenwich. The shape of things to come, he grumbled, pulling up his collar and walking on, head bowed. Once home and in bed, he briefly wondered about the mysterious voices he'd heard earlier, but dismissed them as coming from a house party on the opposite quay. When Monday arrived, Regan set off in his taxi for St. Edmund's Church, just before 2 o'clock, armed with a video recorder in its case. He was excited by the prospect of preserving one of the island's oldest and most important landmarks on film before it was lost forever. So many places had been demolished or repurposed since the docks closed, on top of the devastation caused by wartime bombing 50 years earlier. He often told family and friends how he longed to go back in time and capture those precious places for posterity. So his brothers had presented him with a video recorder at Christmas. Now he had his first chance to use it. Only 2 hours remained until sunset, but the sky was clear, blue, and cloudless. Perfect light for filming, he mused. As he neared the church, he fretted that Cathy might have forgotten about meeting him, but there she was, already waiting at the entrance. After parking outside the boarded-up Telegraph pub, he crossed Westferry Road and greeted her. "The church hasn't been cleared yet, George, but it's all going into storage this week. Close the door behind you, and I'll come back at 4 to lock up." He thanked her and promised nothing would be disturbed, but she trusted him to respect the church, which they'd both known since childhood. As soon as Regan passed through St. Edmund's gabled doorway into its dimly lit vestibule, it immediately evoked memories of attending Mass there as a boy every Sunday morning. His Catholic faith had long since lapsed, and he'd only returned for an occasional baptism, wedding, or funeral. But the sights and smells that greeted him were instantly familiar, though the church had clearly seen better days. The interior still contained all its furniture and fittings, although a few artefacts, including the christening font, had been relocated to the vestibule, making it appear cluttered. He entered the red-carpeted central aisle and sat on the nearest pew to his right. There was a lot to take in. The old church was in a sorry state and showing all of its 120 years. The intense winter sunlight filtering through the leaded lancet windows illuminated its white-painted east walls, highlighting an extensive network of deep, dark, and wide cracks crisscrossing them. George could see at once why the building was earmarked for demolition. Structural problems had been identified with the church's foundations shortly after it opened in 1874, having been laid on subsoil to save money. Lying below the level of high tide, the Isle of Dogs was prone to regular flooding from the nearby Thames, which only made matters worse. If the foundations hadn't been reinforced within a few years of its consecration, St. Edmunds could have never survived to the present day. Regan wasn't sure how long his new camera's battery would last, so he worked out the best order in which to film. Although St. Edmunds lacked the grandeur and scale of larger churches, it was undoubtedly pretty, with a welcoming ambience that belied its austere Gothic exterior. The domed roof above the sanctuary was particularly attractive. Its midnight blue boards were overlaid with red and gold wooden panels and decorated with hundreds of small gold-painted stars. A large figure of Jesus on the cross was suspended just below it. He resolved to record this outstanding feature while the natural light was still favourable. Switching on the camera, he strapped it to his shoulder and began filming, monitoring the view through its eyepiece. After capturing the sanctuary roof, he moved back down the aisle towards the vestibule while trying to keep the large, heavy machine as steady as possible. He tracked along and across the whole roof with its distinctive arch-braced collar trusses, occasionally zooming in as he became more comfortable using the camera. He rested on a pew to give his aching shoulder a break before returning to the sanctuary to record the altar, tabernacle and pulpit and every object within the nave and sanctuary, from the antiquated pipe organ to the 14 stages of the cross. Satisfied with his progress so far, Regan turned off the camera, put it down next to him and checked his watch. He'd already been filming for well over an hour and the sunlight was fading fast. Cathy would be returning before long, so he decided to film inside the vestibule, then call it a day. Gently easing through its double doors with his free left hand while squinting through the viewer, he noticed how the setting sun lent a warm orange patina to its wooden frames. A large oak display cabinet was directly in front of him, full of objects he couldn't quite make out, so he veered right. An elegant, slender vase of red roses stood atop the octagonal white christening font in the far corner. It cast a soft shadow on the back wall, along with George's own outline, and he wondered if the roses were real. Turning again, he directed the lens at the holy water font. There was a notice board directly behind it, and he focused on a poster offering a mental illness helpline. The dimming light and confined space in the vestibule was making him feel slightly uneasy for the first time since he arrived, and he was tiring from the concentration of filming. It was turning colder now, so he lowered the camera and moved back to where he'd left his coat, only to be startled by his own reflection in the glazed side entrance door. "Oh, get a grip, George," he mumbled, taking a deep breath. Just as he was putting the camera back in its case, an unearthly sound from behind chilled him to the bone. He recognized the same voices he'd heard on New Year's Eve by the dock, again whispering, "Benny," followed by words he couldn't make out. With heart thumping and fearing the worst, he spun around to find he was still alone. A brief moment of silence followed. Then the ghostly voices resumed. "Who's there?" he gasped. It's not funny." The voices seemed to be coming from the display cabinet facing the church's central aisle. His first thought was to just leave and wait outside for Cathy, but with curiosity overriding his fear, he found himself slowly moving towards the cabinet. The top section of the unit had 3 locked glass doors. All George could see inside were some pamphlets, candle holders and other trinkets. It was now clear that the sound was coming from the unit below, which had 3 doors and no windows. The central door was slightly ajar. "I'm cracking up," he thought, but the voices were becoming louder and even more insistent. Summoning as much courage as he could, he tugged the open door's handle, and the room fell silent. Feeling relieved and slightly emboldened, he knelt down to peer inside. All it contained was a solitary book. He carefully took it out, to study more closely in what remained of the light. The book was called The Timeless Place, and had a very worn and faded white leather cover. A neat, handwritten Latin inscription on the inside page read, Bene eligere, prudente eligere, though George had no idea what that meant. A quick thumb through the pages revealed it to be a poetry collection. Then he heard Cathy calling his name from outside the main door. Without a second thought, he closed the unit door, tucked the book inside the camera case, grabbed his cap and coat, and exited the old church for the last time. As he drove home, Regan's mind was full of bewildering questions about what he'd just experienced. Was it a spiritual intervention, a haunted presence within the vestibule, or simply the atmosphere spooking him? Well, the book was real enough, but there appeared to be nothing exceptional about it. For his own peace of mind, he resolved not to look at the book or the footage he'd filmed that evening, so he left it in the camera case for the time being. After a remarkably untroubled night, Regan awoke to another fine January morning, feeling much more settled. He was keen to inspect the book, but was wary of doing this inside his home. It occurred to him just how strange it was to think like that, but yesterday's events had been odd, to say the least. He decided the best place to read it was by the river in the familiar setting of the island gardens. So, just before 10, with the book tucked inside his jacket pocket, he crossed the Glengall Bridge, then cut through the Mudchute Farm and Millwall Park towards his intended destination. Hardly anyone was in the island gardens when he arrived, bar a few folk entering or leaving the Greenwich Foot Tunnel. He settled into one of the wooden benches facing the Naval College on the opposite shore. It was a magnificent view, one he never tired of. Its gleaming white exterior was flanked by the 4 brownstone-clad chimney stacks of the power station on one side, and the elegant masts of the Cutty Sark clipper on the other, next to the foot tunnel's distinctive domed entrance. In the distance behind the college, George could see the statue of General James Wolfe, Victor of Quebec, on top of Observatory Hill. The Royal Observatory and the historic Prime Meridian line connecting east to west, pole to pole, and passing through the equator stood close by. The river was at full high tide and almost empty, apart from a sightseeing boat by Greenwich Pier and a passing barge carrying waste east to the landfill site at Mucking Marshes. He took out the mysterious book and turned quickly to the first poem. There was a lot to take in. It was Percy Bysshe Shelley's Time Long Past. Like the ghost of a dear friend dead is time long past, a tone which is now forever fled, a hope which is now forever past, a love so sweet it could not last, was time long past. There were sweet dreams in the night of time long past, and was it sadness or delight, each day a shadow onward cast, which made us wish it yet might last, that time long past? There is regret, almost remorse, for time long past. 'Tis like a child's beloved course a father watches, till at last beauty is like remembrance cast from time long past. As he spoke, George found himself drawn into the page and feeling light-headed, so he closed his eyes in an effort to steady himself. When he opened them again, he beheld a scene so extraordinary that he rose from his seat to fully take it in. The river was now full of ships, barks, schooners, brigs, and ketches, with several skiffs rowed by watermen ferrying passengers between ship and shore. Most of these vessels were moored mid-river, though a few were drifting on the tide. Still trying to fathom exactly what he was seeing, George's attention was drawn to the near shore. The black metal railings lining the gardens had been replaced by a wooden rail, and he was able to move nearer the sloping bank. A cold sensation beneath his shoes caused him to look down. He was now standing on damp grass rather than tarmac. The formal gardens and trees behind him had been replaced by flat green pasture as far as his eye could see. Cattle were grazing a stone's throw away, with only simple wooden fences between them and the river. On the opposite shore he could still see the familiar white college buildings, and they looked much the same, but the power station, Cutty Sark, and foot tunnel entrance had all vanished. "Don't be afraid. You're safe here." A soft female voice to his right startled George. It came from a dark-haired young lady of 19 or 20 who was occupying the bench where he'd just been. She smiled reassuringly, and relieved to no longer be alone, he approached her. "Is this real, or am I dreaming?" "Oh, you're not dreaming. I got here the same way by reading the book you're holding. My name's Lizzy. Come and sit with me, and I'll try to explain." He did as she asked, and listened intently as her story unfolded. "I lived in Westferry Road, between St. Cuthbert's Church and a pub, with my parents and younger sister. Harbinger School was behind us. It was the day the bombing started. The sirens went off about 5:30 when it was still daylight. We went into the little shelter in our backyard like we always did. Nothing had ever happened before, so we didn't expect anything this time. But then we heard the planes come over and explosions. We were terrified. The shelter shook. You could smell the smoke, and the noise was deafening. The bombing stopped after dark, and the all clear sounded, so we came out to check if the house and street outside were all right. The wharves near the river were burning, but the houses hadn't been hit. Dad said they were dropping firebombs. Suddenly, the sirens sounded again. We ran back through the house to the shelter, and all hell broke loose. You could hear so many planes and bombs whistling through the air and going off, you thought each one was going to land on you. Buildings were falling all around us, and we wondered if it would ever end. It was cold in the shelter, but we had warm blankets and didn't dare leave again. We were tired, but no one could sleep through all that. Mum and Dad kept talking to take our minds off it, though they must have been petrified too, bless them both. I tried to stay awake, but must have dozed off for a little while. When I woke up, it was much quieter outside, and everyone was asleep. I felt shivery and needed to use the toilet. I peeked outside. The house wasn't damaged, so I ran towards our toilet a few yards away. Next thing I knew, I was flat on my back and covered in rubble. My eyes were closed, my mouth was choking with dirt, and I could hardly see, hear, or breathe. I got to my feet somehow and saw our house was in ruins, and our neighbours too. All that was left was a big pile of bricks and dust. The yard was pitch black. The shelter had disappeared, and there was no sign of my family. I remember staggering into the street outside, crying and calling for my mum and dad, but there was no answer. The air was thick with choking dust, and the smoke made my eyes sting. The main road was full of bricks, wood and glass. Water was pouring out of the mains, and everything seemed to be on fire. I walked up to the church, still feeling dizzy from the blast. The whole of its front was completely ripped open. You could see everything inside. People were gathering, and I could hear voices, but I couldn't understand a word. I sat down outside the church, with hymn books scattered all around me, and picked one up. Suddenly there was another loud crash nearby. Lumps of concrete were falling, and all I wanted to do was get as far away as possible. I went back to my house and called out to my parents again. Nothing. So I carried on walking through the rubble. Fire engines were trying to get through, and injured people were lying in the street begging for help. I ended up on the corner of Ferry Street, and my mind was getting clearer. Bombs were still going off around Millwall Park. I decided to take cover in the island gardens, hid under a tree in the playground, and fell asleep straight away. Everything was quiet in the morning, except for the birds singing, and I've never been so glad to hear them. My ears were ringing, though, and I was worried about my family. Were they still alive or hurt? I tried to recall what I'd seen, but it was too confusing. The hymn book I'd picked up was next to me. I wondered if it might be the only thing left from where I lived. I was thirsty, dirty and cold, and walked by the river to decide what to do next. I always loved sitting on this bench, so I rested here for ages, thinking. I opened up the book, thinking a hymn might lift my spirits, but it was just poems. The first one was all about lost time, and as I read it, my eyes closed, and I found myself where we are now. It felt so peaceful and looked so beautiful that I stayed for what seemed like hours, drifting in and out of sleep. I was alone until an elderly woman came along and spoke to me. She said that the book's a portal to a place where time no longer matters and only appears to those who really need it. I told her all about the bombing and my family. She said, "Lizzy, did you see the words written on the first page? They mean choose well and choose wisely. So you can choose to stay here or return to your own time. But you only have until the tide goes out to decide, and it's just come in. If you want to leave, all you need to do is read that first poem again before the tide's all the way out. If not, you can remain with us forever. Either way, the book will go back to find the next person who needs it." I didn't really understand what I was being told, so I looked back down at the book, completely confused. And when I looked up again, the lady had disappeared. George listened to Lizzy with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. But how else could he make sense of this pastoral scene all around him? He rose from the bench and stared again at the ships on the river, his head spinning with so many questions. He turned back to Lizzy, but she was no longer there. He was alone again. Well, the tide won't be out for 5 or 6 hours yet, he told himself. There's plenty of time left. After staying where he was for a while, contemplating the views, Regan made up his mind to explore this strange new environment while thinking things through. He could see a few buildings in one direction and some windmills beyond, so he began walking along the winding riverside path towards them. Getting his bearings wasn't easy with only the gentle curve of the river to guide him and a few wind-swept trees as landmarks. The buildings ahead were close to the bank. "Well, that's where the ferry house is," he thought, and his pace quickened. He soon reached the inn, although it looked quite different to the pub he knew so well. Several people were waiting on the river bank, some wearing blue naval uniforms and others in civilian clothes. 2 rowing boats were moored by the shore with watermen aboard, and he guessed they were ferrying passengers across to Greenwich. A small group of men were sitting outside the inn, enjoying the sun and chatting. Observing all this from the path, it seemed to Regan that people here lived life at a much more leisurely pace than he did. A far simpler existence in peaceful surroundings, compared with the competitive urban rat race of modern London with its high-rise concrete estates and social problems. He realized there would be fewer creature comforts here, but that was true of the close-knit community he'd grown up in, and it was the happiest he'd ever been. He continued along the path next to what he took to be the old marsh wall, passing between a short row of cottages behind the inn and 2 men fishing at the river's edge next to a small boatyard. The ground was dry here, and he could see a windmill ahead. As he approached the mill, George wondered why young Lizzy had chosen to stay here. She'd clearly been traumatized by the terrifying events of that fateful night, having lost her home and believing her family had perished in the explosion. It must have been an incredibly difficult decision for one so young, yet she seemed so contented now. He remembered the elderly lady telling her the book only came to those who needed it. So why has it come to me? He wondered. The weight of that question made him pause for a while to survey the river. The winter sun was tracing a low arc west above the ships, and the changing motion of the waves reminded him the tide was already receding, like a relentless, undulating hourglass. Epilogue. On the 8th of September, 1995, Father Jim Fitzgerald was enjoying a quiet evening alone at St. Mildred's Vicarage in Castalia Square. He decided it was time to sort through several boxes of artefacts from St. Edmund's Church, a task he'd been putting off for some time. Work was well underway on the new building, and the larger items were in storage. The young priest opened a plastic crate full of hymn books, and was surprised to come across one that looked much older than the others. The timeless place. Oh, what's that doing there? He turned to the first page and saw a handwritten Latin inscription, which he translated as, "Choose well, choose wisely." Recognizing it as a poetry anthology, his first instinct was to discard it, but the intriguing message made him think again, so he placed it on the bookshelf to look at later. Earlier that day, George Regan stopped to catch his breath on reaching the top of a steep climb up to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich Park. He weaved through the crowd of tourists taking photographs of the Shepherd Gate clock just outside the prime meridian and sat down in front of Wolfe's Column. He surveyed the panoramic view of the museums and college below with his island home in the background. The stainless steel roof of the Canary Wharf Tower dominated the skyline above the college's majestic white domes, in contrast to the sympathetic green backdrop of the island garden's trees, which perfectly complemented them. In his mind's eye, George drew an imaginary golden line from the prime meridian that arrowed across the Thames, passing through the island gardens on its way to the point of the skyscraper's glinting pyramidion. An hour later, he emerged from the Greenwich Foot Tunnel's north entrance and entered the island gardens. He noticed a woman in her early 70s standing by the riverside bench where he'd sat on that strange day back in January. He waited until she'd left the gardens, then approached it. A large bouquet of white lilies lay there, with a card attached, and George read the inscription. "For my dear sister, Lizzy Johnson, missing from her home since the 8th of September 1940. May you find peace wherever you are."